But then very quickly it dragged on into a month and 2 months and 3 months. And I watched seniors go down the tubes at home.
Yep.
You take a senior with a bad hip who needs to walk every day and you lock them in their house and say they can't go out. Or somebody with dementia and they're a little bit confused at the best times, and it's that daily socialization and the fresh air and things that keep their mind okay. And you lock them in their house for a while. They were miserable and dying because of this. And many of those seniors would have said, look, I don't want this. Don't do this for me. Let my kids go play hockey. Let my kids visit me. If I die, I die. I'll take my chances, but I'd rather have a shorter but better remaining life than to try to extend it by a bit. And it's very analogous to chemo, right? Like, we don't force chemo on people. We could say, hey, you got this terrible pancreatic cancer. This chemo will guarantee you live 8 months instead of 6 months. By the way, it'll make you really sick and you can't see your kids when you're on it. And it's going to, you'll just feel shitty, but you're going to live 8 months. So therefore you have to take it. We don't do that. We say, here's the chemo, here's the upsides, here's the downsides. Do you want it? And a lot of people say no to chemo for that reason. They'd rather have a shorter and better life. And similarly, a lot of the seniors I talked to said to me, I'd rather take my chances. I'd rather be allowed to take my chances.
Right. I've heard that so many times.
Some seniors wanted to stay locked down and they're pretty happy being at home. And a lot of them were like, they know how to use FaceTime. They like the TV, they like the internet, and they were okay at home more so. But then other seniors I know don't have a computer. They're too deaf to really talk well on the phone. And they were absolutely because we're still locked down to some extent here. It was been an absolutely miserable 2 years for them, and they've suffered and died because of lockdown.
Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. Secondary guidance systems engaged. Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark.
You brought up that nondescript person with a bad hip and how they need to get out and walk around and how that's good for them socially. But I don't think people understand too, and obviously you could speak to this better, but I don't think people understand that person with the bad hip who's getting out and walking around, who's not only are they getting the social interaction, but that exercise is good for them physically for that bad hip. And now you take that person, you confine them to their home, you isolate them from friends, family, and neighbors that they're talking to on a regular basis. They're not getting that exercise that nobody really notes as being a intensive exercise, but they're not getting that exercise. Their physical health begins to deteriorate in that one spot that they've been keeping active. And once that starts to deteriorate, that brings the pain and everything else to the rest of the body. That then compounds it, and I know your wife could speak to this, compounds it from a psychological degree, so that not only are they having physical maladies, but now they're having psychiatric or psychological issues that are getting compounded, and now the depression to the illness or to the pain sets in, and they give up. And that we saw that time and time again here in the States. People in nursing homes that weren't ill just gave up. They just gave up. And then, of course, the ones that, look at Michigan and Minnesota and New York are good examples of this as well, that are now exposed to people who are forced into long-term care centers.
Yeah.
No one there to take care of them. No one there to, outside of the CNAs and what. But so the physical deterioration compounds it and makes it even worse. Like we committed a kind of almost a mini Holocaust with some of this in the way we treated our elderly, or our people who were not necessarily elderly, but immobile.
Yeah. Frail.
And frail. Mm-hmm. And we killed thousands of them.
Yeah. Thousands of them
for no good reason. And not that there's ever a good reason, but literally it didn't do what we were told it was going to do.
Yeah. I'll tell you a couple of stories. So the first story is, a good buddy of mine, his dad went into a nursing home about 6 months before COVID started. And his dad was very sound of mind, but frail of body. Thus needed nursing home. And was doing okay in the nursing home. It was a hard adjustment for him. He had lost his wife a couple of years before and whatnot. So he wasn't great, but he wasn't too bad. And my friend would go and visit him numerous times per week, and he was well enough. He would go out for drives and things like that. And then COVID hit, and his dad was somewhat deaf, couldn't navigate an iPad, couldn't really talk well on the phone. They tried to do these window visits. I don't know if you've heard about this.
Yes, heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's a great visit, right? Anyway, his dad gave up and stopped eating and died. That was, he was dead within about 2 months of lockdown. And he died because of the lockdown. And I can name you, because I look after the home. There's definitely lots of those patients. I'll tell you another story, which was very kind of a bit emotional.
These hurt. So hearing these stories, go ahead.
My brother does some acupuncture and things, and one of his patients was a lady well in her 70s who had you kind of brought her up to mind because you mentioned bad hip. She had quite a bad and arthritic hip that she was kind of waiting to get replaced and trying to put it off, and was doing okay. And then lockdown hit. She got locked in her house, a very little tiny house. She got locked in there, couldn't really go anywhere, was in for a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. And then finally her hip was so painful that she decided she was going to go for a walk. So she drove down to the main street of our town. There was nobody else there. She parked her car. There was no other parked car within that half a mile of her, and got out with her walker and started to walk down the street. And within a block, a police car pulled up, sideways on the street, blocking the street, lights on, flashing. Police officer came out with a mask on, stood away from her and said, "You can't be out," blah, 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 gave her a $1,000 ticket and sent her back to her car to rot in her house. And I just look at that and I think, you could say that police officer's just doing her job. And I say, yes, just the guards at Auschwitz were doing their job. If you couldn't, as a human being, talk to that lady and say, "Hey, what's the deal? People are supposed to be in," and she could have said, "Look, here's my situation, why not?" And if we don't have a society where we can't let an old lady walk down the street, and we've gone to a really bad place.
I think that sums up everything about what you and the others in Canada, because I know you guys aren't the only doctors that are speaking out now. It really kind of sums up where Canada's at. It sums up where the United States is at. That you look at America's frontline doctors, like, notably well respected up until 2020. And then a few months into 2020, all of a sudden now they're suspect. Their credentials should probably be pulled because they're clearly, not trustworthy. And I just interviewed a gal yesterday, had a conversation with her, met her through this medical freedom clinic endeavor that we're taking on. And she's a nurse practitioner living in Montana who lost her job for being a dissident. And she said, "You know what? I'm going to go do my own thing." And what it's done for her is it's not only has it opened her eyes socio-politically and socio-culturally, but it's also opened her eyes in medicine, where she said the United States has stopped being about healthcare and has become sick care. Mm-hmm. We're treating the symptoms of the illness instead of trying to find out what's causing the illness, treating the illness, or even preventing it. And she goes, that's how we've ended up where we are. And it's completely changed her philosophy of medical practice. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, there's some positives that are going to come out of all of this. Mm-hmm. And if one of that is getting people to open their eyes and to change their philosophies, so that they're doing what's better for whether you're a doctor or you're a politician or you're in law enforcement or some other field, if it's changing how you're looking at other people and changing how you're interacting with them for the positive, that's phenomenal. But no, they don't want that. They don't want you to think for yourself. They darn sure don't want you Canadian doctors thinking for yourselves.
No.
How close do you think it's been for you guys? I mean, and I want you to tell this story because you'll tell it better than me, because they kind of, Canada's kind of backed themselves into a corner when it comes to your services and your wife's services. They'd like to, if I understood you correctly, they'd like to take away your certifications, but they can't. But why is that?
Yeah, I'm sure. I can't speak for them. I'm just trying to get into their heads. But
That's your wife's job.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, the regulatory college in Nova Scotia is not my friend, that's for sure. And I'm sure they would like to be rid of me. I'm sure I'm considered to be just a pain in the ass, and they'd love to pull the plug on me. But it's tough politically because we're really, really short of doctors. So we're so short of doctors. If they pull the plug on my license, then there's going to be a few thousand people in this area where I work who will be without a physician, and the whole, like, we're such a house of cards right now that it would put too much pressure on the other docs left, and they might not stay. So the whole healthcare in this whole part of Nova Scotia would probably crumble, and that would look pretty bad on them. So I think there's pressure on them. They're probably trying to thread that needle between shutting me up but not getting rid of me, right? But I'm as they're finding out, I'm a hard guy to shut up, for better or for worse. I'm almost a free speech absolutist. I'm pretty close to a free speech absolutist. I think people should be allowed to say what they say all the time. And that said, I don't think I'm right all the time. But part of the reason I speak is because I want to put my ideas out there. And hell, if I'm wrong, if you have a better idea, that's good. Now I learned something, right? And I can back off and say, oh shit, was I ever wrong about that? This guy's opinion is better than mine. But how am I ever going to know that if I don't get it out there, right? So,
well, that's the thing. Like literally, it's not free speech if you can only say the things that are deemed correct by society and culture. You have to be an absolutist. I'm like, even to the point of people talk, in the United States, the example is always, well, you can't run into a crowded theater and yell fire. I'm like, sure you can. I don't see why you can't. Like, there's no reason you can't. Now there might be consequences for that. And I'm not advocating for irresponsible behavior, but my point is that we always illustrate the idea of free speech, especially, or even, freedom to bear arms, which Canada knows nothing about as well. We always go to these worst case examples. Oh, well, your freedom of speech could lead to thousands of people trampling each other at a soccer game. Oh, wait, that happens anyway, right? Instead of addressing this and saying that free speech is actually a protective for the people, it's good for the people.
Yeah.
It's very good for the people. And like, to your point, how am I ever going to learn I'm wrong on something if everything that I'm saying is censored, or I'm not allowed to ever say, let alone censored and like eliminated? But like, if you even so much as start to utter it, somebody steps in and tells you, get back in your car and go home.
Yeah.
To use that illustration, you have to have those challenges, or you're going to experience an intellectual isolation, which is going to put you into a feedback loop that ultimately will end up killing you on a psychological and intellectual level.
I agree. So I'm going to actually, believe it or not, I'm going to argue the other side of this, because again, to steelman it. And I'm going to recommend a book. There's a book by a guy called Timothy Garton Ash. It's a hyphenated last name. I think it's Garton Ash.
You'll have to send me that in an email so I can link it in the description.
Yeah, and I think it's just called Free Speech, if I remember right. And it's a really good book. He traces the history of free speech and whatnot. And quite a good read. See, there is another side to these things. I am not. So I said I'm almost a free speech absolutist. Yeah. I do think there are bounds, and where these bounds,
absolutely,
where the bounds lie to me. So, for instance, nobody forced me to be a doc.
Right.
So, it's not like, it's not like somebody put a gun in my head and said you have to be a doctor. So here I am. If I said something like, if I went public and said, I'm going to be the new head of the KKK in Nova Scotia, not that we have one, and I hate black people and I don't think they should get health care, well, I think I should be out on my ass. But the reason for that is that 99.999% of people would agree with that. It's not like it's not like I'm expressing an opinion that's on one side of the political spectrum and there's
Right.
that's an extreme fringe position which clearly disadvantages a group of people. So I think you would get universal agreement amongst doctors, amongst people in society, that anybody who says that kind of toxic thing should not be a physician. Similarly, if you're the CEO of a major corporation that produces widgets, and you go public and say, I think our widgets suck shit and you should buy widgets from the other company, I
Right.
think fair enough. It isn't, in a way, an infringement on your free speech to be fired, but it's fair enough because that's
Consequences.
so there are these bounds. There are these reasonable bounds on free speech. So that's why I say I'm not an absolutist. But where we've seen this creep now is it would truly be harmful for Black people if I said I'm not going to care for Black people as a physician. That's truly harmful, right?
Right.
But
you're advocating for harm to someone based on their ethnicity.
Right. But what we've done now, so for instance, one of the things I got in trouble for with my college was there was a bill that was passed in Canada, Bill M103, called the Anti-Islamophobia Bill. And what this bill essentially enshrined was that if you criticize Islam and thereby hurt somebody's feelings, you were kind of committing a crime, and the Human Rights Tribunal could fine you or shut you up or whatever. And
there was jail time. There's jail time with that, correct?
Well, there's jail time at the end of any fine. You don't pay any fine, and you can end up in jail eventually, right?
But I couldn't remember if that particular one detailed like a set of circumstances as well. Because was it C16 that does that?
I think C16. I'd have to look at it, but ultimately, all laws are enforced at the end of a gun barrel, right? So if you don't
monopoly of force.
Yeah, you don't pay a fine, they come for you. You push back, they come for you more. So my point was, we have to be free to criticize religion. And I wrote a social media post to that effect. And at the time, polling showed that about 60% of Canadians were actually on my side of that argument. And I got in trouble with my medical regulatory college for that, right? And so that is the extreme that we've gone to. I wasn't expressing.
Well, it's because you were okay with being free to criticize a particular religion. If you had chosen to criticize another religion, say Judeo-Christian values, they probably would have been okay with that.
1,000%. So if you want to go after the Catholic Church these days and say that they should be, you could say anything bad about the Catholic Church. All priests are pedophiles and they're terrible, blah, blah, blah. And nobody would ever say anything. But you want to criticize Islam to the same degree. And now we have a bill against it in Canada. So it's really weird to me. And, again, it's part of, to me, it's that attack and that hatred of our own values in the West that's come out of postmodernism that has pushed us to this place, right?
Right. Absolutely. Well, and I should have known this was going to be a long conversation. I think we're splitting this up into sections, buddy. The issue is not so well. I think where we agree is that I'm not a free speech absolutist in that, like, you should be able to say and literally advocate for harm on people. Where I say I'm an absolutist is that, like, you can literally go out and say whatever you want to say in public. You literally can. And the government, sure, like, if you want to go out, and I'm not advocating for this, but if you wanted to go out and advocate for the violent overthrow of government, you certainly have the freedom to do it. You're probably going to pay the consequences for it. And there again, like you said, if you critique your company that you work for, and you're the CEO, and you go out and you bash the company, well, there's no obligation on their part to protect your ability to say that. You will pay the consequences. But all of this ties into this reality of where we agree, the other side doesn't want any of that. They don't want any guarantees. They don't want any protections. They want to dictate what is harmful. They want to dictate what is helpful. They want to dictate what is okay and what's not okay, what's moral and what's immoral. They have no basis for it other than people's feelings. And they want to determine for you what's safe and what's not safe, just in speech. And when they could do that, when they could do that, you end up with this anti-Islamophobia situation where going out and critiquing or even making a lambasting or lampooning the prophet in an act of satire could literally end your freedoms. And that is terrifying. That should, it's the same thing there again with, I mentioned C16, which I think had something to do with was it preaching against homosexuality or something along those lines?
It was more general, I believe. It was more to do with sort of internet censorship and things. It was a little more broad ranging.
I can't remember. You guys have been dealing with a lot of this stuff up there. It's just been nonstop. So where we're at is you're over here advocating for a free exchange of ideas, which is ultimately what free speech is about. Is the free exchange of ideas, a philosophical interaction, a creedal interaction, a dogmatic interaction, challenging other people to really think about their positions and where they're at and how they got there. And they're really, what they've done with all of these other things, even outside of the Coof restrictions, is they've actually socially isolated us from being challenged by what could be a viral idea of, you might be wrong and I should be able to challenge you on that. And I think that has what led to some degree, their ability to do what they've done in Canada and to some degree here in the United States, which is continue to drive these wedges of separation between different people groups, whether it be based on ethnicity or religion or creed, to the point where we just accepted everything that came our way over these last 2 years as being okay, because we haven't ever been challenged in our thought process. There are entire generations of people that do not know how to interact when they've been challenged.
Yeah, I agree. The Coddling of the American Mind is an awesome book, right? You're probably well familiar with it. I'll kind of, I'm going to back up. I'll tell you kind of a general story. People talk about the Overton window, right? That idea of the Overton.
Yeah.
What's within,
which is racist now, by the way.
Yeah, right. I heard that. Yeah. I think it's a great concept, though. Like, I talked to my mother-in-law is 87. She's a fantastic lady and really smart. Kind of grew up real poor on a farm in the middle of nowhere in New Brunswick. And you go back 75, 100 years in Canada and the U.S. And let's take an example. The thought of a 16-year-old girl who had a baby out of wedlock that the taxpayers would be beholden to give her money would be crazy. The most left-wing person 100 years ago would have said, no, you're 16, you had a kid out of wedlock, bad idea. You can go to the church will probably support you. You can go to your local community group, they might support you, but the taxpayer shouldn't have to support you. We'll have a great adoption program or whatever if that kid needs help, but we're not going to give you money for having children, right? Now, just expressing that view, if the college gets a hold of this video, I'm in another whole round of trouble for saying that, right? Because even the most...
No, I'm worried for you.
Even the most, quote unquote, right-wing people now wouldn't ever want to talk against that concept because it's so mainstream now. And the way I look at it, when you get your car aligned, if you're driving down the road, nice straight road, nothing coming, you let your wheel go for a minute and see if it tracks straight. And it's like, oh, if it pulls one way or another, better get it aligned. Well, the societal car has been pulling to the left for a long, long, long time, right? We've just made this constant slide to the left. And I think there's a good reason for that if you look at it. What it is that those of us, looking at left-right is kind of a bit of an artificial divide. I like the libertarian, authoritarian axis is more...
Yeah, absolutely.
constructive. And by the nature of that axis, if you're libertarian, you go live your life, you leave other people alone, you leave politics alone as part of that because you want to live your life and have a good life in your community. But if you're on the authoritarian side, you want to be in politics, you want power, you want to, by the definition of it, you want to control other people's behavior. And because they are preferentially the people who are attracted to politics and attracted to power, we end up moving further and further and further to the left as time goes along, and that's continues to happen. It's sort of a natural progression, and occasionally it happens. Occasionally we lurch so far left that some people just shake their heads and say, wait a minute, they push back against it. But I think we need to be aware of that tendency and that pull and that the Overton window. We haven't been. I think it's gone so far to the left that now people are saying, no, there's a problem here. They're starting to get on and say there's a problem.
Leading into mid-March of 2020, I saw this coming for months. For months, I saw, years. I've been warning people, and of course, I was getting the whole, "Oh, you're crazy," you and your kooky ideas, and I had been telling people for a long time, you just need to be aware, need to be aware, need to be aware. And I was waiting for the thing that was going to come along and wake people up. And at the beginning of March, I started telling now former fellow deputies, like when we were working overnight, and I was telling them, here's the deal. I'm like, here's what's going to happen. Minnesota's going to follow New York, and they're going to follow California. We're going to do everything that they do, probably on the same day or within days of them doing it. And I just went through and I laid it all out. Bam, 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 bam. I told them. And then now they're telling you not to wear face coverings, but then they're going to tell you you have to wear a face covering to be able to do business. And then they're not even talk about a jab for this thing until they're ready to talk about a jab for this thing. And then once they do talk about the jab for this thing, then they're going to want to force you to take the jab, and they're going to put it on. And I just went through and I was telling everybody. And 3, 4, 5 weeks into this, people are coming back to me going, how did you know all of this? How did you see this? And I said, because you got to study these things. You have to be paying attention to what's going on. And this goes to what you're saying about that hard hitting that almost like hitting that really hard as you're drifting to the left down the road because your alignment needs to be fixed. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, you're drifting so far to the left that you hit a pothole in the opposite lane. And it's not just a small one. It's one of those big car destroying kind of potholes that just blows your tire off the rim. That's what Coof did. They went too far and they went too fast because they had been gaining so much traction and drifting so far to the left that the alignment was so bad it just started to take that hard left. And they said, wow, we've got them where we want them. And they did too much. And it was enough to get a few people who were kind of on the cusp of being aware to step back and go, wait, this is kind of scary. Mm-hmm. The problem is, and I don't know, speaking of, from a person who's really immersed in an environment that doesn't have, I don't think people understand just how hard things might be in the States. We still have it a lot better when it comes to some freedoms. Is it enough? Is what's happened enough from your perspective, Chris? Do you think that hard awakening is going to be enough to stop the drift of the Overton window and start to bring it back towards the middle or even towards the right? Mm-hmm. Do you think that's going to work in Canada? Do you think that there's any hope for the Western world, the Americas?
I don't know. I like that the name collapsitarian. There's these collapsitarians who say it's inevitably going to fall apart. It just has to, and then that's fine. We'll figure it out after that. I'm not sure, but I'm getting kind of into that. I don't know if you'd say it's black pilled or not, but I just don't know if it's inevitable. When you go back to Enlightenment philosophy and political philosophy over many centuries, many people felt that where we are now was an inevitable outcome of the Enlightenment. Like, we went into the Enlightenment, this whole personal.
The French Revolution is a really brief example of what that looks like.
Right. Yes. And so, once we start to, once postmodernism comes in at all, it kind of inevitably pushes us to this end, and that asymmetry in power between authoritarians versus libertarians inevitably drags us in that direction. And many people, many wise political philosophers over the years said that this was inevitable that we'd get here. I don't know if it's true or not, or whether we'll kind of come to a balance somewhere and figure out how to keep enough personal liberty to make our society functional. It doesn't feel like it to me right now, but then every once in a while I get glimmers that glimmers of hope, and things that make me hopeful are things like agree with Malone and McCullough or not. The fact that 40 million, 50 million people watched them, and only 5 million people are tuning into MSNBC or whatever it is. That kind of gives me hope that, there's a lot of people out there who want to hear something alternative. They see that society is corrupt and our mainstream institutions are corrupt. They don't believe the media narrative anymore. They don't believe what the government says anymore, and they're going to start to think for themselves. And the conclusions that they come to after thinking for themselves are not as important to me as the fact that they're thinking for themselves. I think just that fact that they are is a really, really, really hopeful sign.